Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of the Superpower Logic Podcast. It is Wednesday, June 24th. I'm your host, Richard Swank, joined as always by my co host, Kelly Jordan, here to discuss the comings and goings of what's going on in America right now. This week, we're going to be talking about U.S. foreign aid and credentialism and what it does, how it impacts the United States government, and how it operates.
Hi, everyone. Nice to see you again. We hope you've been enjoying our episodes. We're certainly having fun doing it. Just a follow up from last week. We discussed a little bit about Micron, the semiconductor plant that is being built in New York State, Clay, New York, and I just wanted to follow up and say they just to clarify that while there has been opposition, actually some of the opposition is being funded by a nonprofit out of California, Jobs for America. It seems like this is a big enough, good enough deal where the local opposition won't be able to completely stop the progress. The justification, they're saying that they want to make sure the jobs are all union and whatnot, but this is actually part of this administration's larger effort to onshore some of the critical components of AI. And I don't remember if I mentioned it or not last week, but Micron at the same time started building out a factory in Idaho. They were also doing a project, again, part of the Chips and Science Act. So this is a bipartisan effort this that was under the Biden administration. And that facility they are up and running. So let's hope that we can continue forward here in New York and bring all those good jobs to New York. And then we were talking about that's part of the larger effort of onshoring the critical components of our economy and AI. But Richard, I'm actually looking forward to discussing this credentialism a little bit because maybe you can tell us a little bit about what it is and do I have the credentials?
So I'll just read the formal definition. Credentialism is the excessive reliance on formal qualifications such as academic degrees, diplomas, or certificates as the primary measure of a person's capability or eligibility for a job, rather than their actual skills, experience, or practical knowledge. So this often leads to something called credential inflation, where employers, particularly the US government, they demand increasingly higher qualifications, even for entry level positions, and it becomes a form of gatekeeping, if you will. I believe that credentialism in entry level positions, particularly in the US government, and it really encourages nepotism. It encourages people who lack practical experience to be hired into these positions and creates a culture of credentialism that lasts throughout a person's career in a bureaucracy like the federal government. Credentialism is, in my opinion, far more likely to occur in government agencies and bureaucracies as opposed to for profit entities. When you look at particularly like Silicon Valley and the tech sector, look at Mark Zuckerberg. He dropped out of Harvard, and he's not the only tech person who went to a place like Harvard or Yale or Stanford and decided it wasn't for them, and had a great idea and ran with it. Unfortunately, that is something that the U.S. government has a very, very difficult time doing, and I believe that it creates a structure at the senior levels of government where one's qualifications on paper are far more important than their practical experience and what they bring to the table as far as skill sets from practical experience. And that's not to say that credentials don't matter. They do. I don't want an airline pilot flying without the proper ratings and types of certificates for the plane he or she is flying, and everything that goes with that. That being said, I take someone who there's so many examples. I use Jake Sullivan, who was President Biden's national security advisor, somebody who to political establishment and the political elite probably comes off as very highly qualified. I would argue he's very highly credentialed and lacks practical skill sets in the national security arena, just as one example. And I think what really gets me upset about credentialism, probably more than anything else, is that it costs people lives. And that is something when you look at some of the foreign policy debacles we've had in our history that we've put people in positions where they are not qualified, and it's cost us American treasure, and it's a real shame. And I think it's only going to get worse because the American political elite still really value the elite university, the elite government institutions like that are, for example, like the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, things like that.
Yeah, I was gonna say this immediately makes me think of a couple things, comes to mind, right? These elite universities where and I my mind goes actually to a few places, but one of them is education where credentialism serves as a roadblock or an obstacle to getting into schools. Now, of course, we don't want just anyone with our students teaching our students, but for example, even though I have a bachelor's degree and I have experience with children, want to teach them, for me to get certified as a teacher in New York, I was looking at a few years, so I stopped working a few years and the shortest program locally here was going to be $80,000. So in that case, in that case, maybe we're not letting in the best people with practical knowledge, right? That can actually do it to go to teach. But how do you think that the universities play into it? Because they're almost like the credential masters, right? Like, oh, we award you this. It's like a noble title, right? You have been accepted.
Right. So I think that's a really good point, and I believe that credentialism is almost a cheat code. It's also a shortcut for leadership, and what I mean by that is anybody who's hiring. We all know that there's keyword searches and resumes and whatnot, but I've long believed that there's a list of universities where if you went to that university, your resume is going to go in a different pile. The Ivy League, Stanford, Northwestern, Vanderbilt, you get the idea, right? The service academies, these elite institutions. What what happens over time, in my opinion, is that as a senior leader, it's credentialism is an easy filter for being qualified. Instead of taking the time to look at a person's experience, talk to them, actually interview them, engage with them. It's easy to just weed them out, and it's really got to the point where I think that to your point about universities, it really does start there because when you're 17, 18, and you're making that decision about where to go to school, you have that in mind that, okay, my resume is going to be treated differently for the rest of my life if I go to University A over University B.
I think one example, and this example of a woman who was a JP Morgan employee who was caught stealing a Nick's garbage can. Actually,
I
did you
saw
see
this.
this viral video? And so here she is. She ends up, I believe, to be fair, I believe she, like as it says here, at the infatuation, which was acquired by JP Morgan Chase. But you look at a resume like this, and one might argue, these big JP Morgan Chase is a very desirable company to be working for, and she worked in DEI. There's a lot of people questioning whether her resume and her experience would get her a job at JP Morgan Chase.
Well, I think credentialism, yeah, you certainly have it can be expanded to more than just a piece of paper. I believe like credentialism can be partially to explain for when you expand credentialism, you kind of get into the DEI world.
Yeah.
And that it's so easy to apply the DEI filters, particularly in her position, which let's face it, she's not an investment banker or anything like that. She's in a fairly useless position, and so hiring her, making her a DEI hire, DEI wouldn't be a big deal if it was just in positions like that in companies. DEI is a big deal when it comes to medicine and aviation and manufacturing and things like that. So, but yeah, I do think you bring up a really good point about that woman that credentialism can be easily expanded into was probably a part of the reason why DEI became a thing, and that okay, you have to check all the boxes, and why not go beyond where you went to school, what certifications you have that are somewhat meaningless, and let's expand it to your race, your gender, your sexual orientation. It's a
Arbitrary
it's easy to
cri
go from A to B there. It's very linear.
yeah, arbitrary criteria or immutable physical characteristics, right? I've if there's I see credentialism. And again, awarding, you're awarding or entitled or considered for certain positions or considered autom if you carry certain credentials, you can maybe some people automatically consider you to be, knowledgeable or, a series of things. But if what is really, if it's not merit based and those credentials don't, we'll get to the point where all credentials mean nothing if this pendulum swings too far and people earn credentials based on, immutable characteristics or a Harvard diploma, right? For the first time, we're hearing companies saying, "Whoa, maybe we're not ready to just go hire right from Harvard." Or and those elite universities where their name was everything because it got you in the door. When credentialism swings too far, and jobs and or they're awarded based on these somewhat arbitrary, unless I'm misunderstanding you here, but somewhat arbitrary.
And
And
I wonder how the university system with all the issues that universities are having these days, and younger people in particular questioning the value of a four-year degree more than ever, how that will impact credentialism moving forward.
yeah, and when
Again,
you
go ahead.
like Meta, they're some of these big tech companies, they're actually looking to hire people directly out of high school. They don't want to have been influenced by the universities.
Yeah, and I think that when you look at how different sectors are handling this situation, again, I think credentialism is by far and away most troubling in government because for-profit entities want to make money, and obviously that's not the government's focus at all. But to your point about universities, I think part of it is also just that it's such a complicated relationship that's so intertwined between the federal government and universities and student loans and how student loans increasing over time and tuition going up pretty much the way the federal government's spending on student loans has increased is very telling about their relationship and the drug deal, if you will, between universities, the government, and this issue of credentialism.
Yes. And again, when the government is willing, when the risk is not on the individuals or the universities, like a thought I always had is why not put these universities on the hook for the first, even if it's $2,500, 5,000, maybe a percentage of the loans when they default. My guess is the universities, because they don't have skin in the game here. So my guess is the universities would respond and maybe try to sharpen up their programs or better filter the people coming in and more align the amount of loans and the degrees they're willing to give with the potential to earn and pay that back. I know here, the University of Rochester, a private school, is like $97,000 all in for the year if you're an international student. But and the for an international student, I believe that includes just some fees for, I don't know, visas or whatnot. There's some extra, maybe some sort of health insurance, but ultimately, if the University of Rochester is going to be $90,000, right? And they're going to be providing and offering degrees that 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 there's no way that the kids graduating could rack up that kind of debt and realistically pay them back if the University of Rochester had to contribute some, had more skin in the game. I wonder what it would do to this credentialism and this. It's almost like they just churn them out.
Right. And I think that when you really dive into I I guess it just really bothers me that it's such a easy way to judge someone's qualifications, but it's a shallow way to judge their qualifications. It doesn't require critical thinking, and in many ways, when you check all those boxes, there's a sense of entitlement. I've earned these degrees, I've earned these qualifications that may or may not be because. not all qualifications are equal. Again, being a medical doctor or a pilot, those are real qualifications that are important. Being an engineer, if you're going to design, a bridge, an architect, those are real qualifications that are important. Saying that you've attended all the right professional military education and the Kennedy School of Government, so therefore you should be able to command this or do this. Then you add in DEI. That is not, to me, that is not a qualification. That is checking boxes, getting through hurdles, artificial hurdles, mind you, and putting people in positions where they are not qualified and don't have the experience. And in many ways, credentialism is the ultimate Peter principle. You get promoted to your level of incompetence. And unfortunately, credentialism, a lot of times it gets you a little bit above the Peter principle and you're a level or two above your level of incompetence. And so
Yeah.
and
I
I
mean,
I see it a lot in the mainstream media too. When people talk about how smart someone is because of where they've gone to school and what degrees they've earned, and that false sense of security and having confidence in someone that has no business being in the position they're in.
yeah, and I think you mentioned earlier Jake Sullivan. Now, hit somebody. What was his experience before
He
he
was, let's bring it up here. He's an attorney. He was the national security advisor. He was the deputy chief of staff to Hillary Clinton at the State Department. He went to Yale Law School. He was a senior policy advisor on Hillary Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign. He was editor of the Yale Law Journal, the Yale Law and Policy Review, and the Yale Daily News. He interned at the Council on Foreign Relations, was a member of the Yale Debate Association, and earned a Truman Scholarship in his junior year. He also worked for the Brookings Institution and the Yale Center for the Study of Globalization. He practiced private law in Minneapolis and taught law at the University of St. Thomas School of Law. After that, he worked as chief counsel to Minnesota Senator Amy Klobuchar, who connected him to Hillary Clinton. So again, you get to this idea that he's done a lot of impressive things on paper. Those are impressive institutions and clearly he's doing things, but has he really been in the trenches in the national security space? No,
yeah.
he's been talking about it and reading about it, but he really hasn't been in the arena. I think again, when you look at something like Mr. Sullivan and the debacle that was the Afghanistan withdrawal and all the mistakes that were made there, the national security advisor has a part in that. And again, not somebody, in my opinion, who has the practical experience and knowledge to be in a position like that. And we'll probably never know the whole story, but I believe he certainly had some role to play in how the withdrawal was planned and executed. He is the national security advisor. So, you get to take credit when things go well. You have to own the some of the blame when things don't go well. And certainly the withdrawal in Afghanistan did not go well.
Yeah. I just am reading. I found this beautiful description, credentialism, and I just want to read quickly, it just briefly this, and we'll post a link to where this comes from. But the end of credentialism and the rise of meritocracy can be a thing of beauty, but like so many beautiful things, it will be precious and it will be fragile. The rise of meritocracy will be a continuous project and will need its shepherds and stewards. The plain fact is that credentialism is a fallback when the project of civil society fails. Because credentialism is gameable by the simple, it is preferred by the masses who demand recognition, status, and respect, in spite of their ability, in spite of their unproductive nature.
Hard to top that on this topic. It's and I like how that was framed, credentialism versus meritocracy. One of the things that is beautiful about sports is the ultimate meritocracy. You can't fake your way into hitting a major league fastball. You're either good at it or you're not. And you can't fake your way to being a quarterback in the NFL. Everybody can see if one is good at it or not. And if you're really good, it doesn't matter where you went to college. It doesn't matter how you look. Nobody cares. And I love that about sports. And in some ways, the uniformed armed forces are like that too. People really don't care about where you went to school. Men don't care where their command went as far as a ROTC or West Point or officer candidate school. They just want them to be good leaders, good commanding officers. And so I really like what you read there.
Right, right. To your point, Richard, credentialism, like so much rot, has precedent in academia. Consider peer review. Peer review essentially improves the credibility of scientific works and helps to prevent fraud while keeping the standards of published research in different fields appropriately high. Appropriately high. But it does no such thing. It amounts to little more than an expensive attempt to make the status and opinions of academics sacrosanct. So we'll post a link for this if you're interested in learning a little bit more about credentialism and its effects in, in our show description here. But so to your point on credentialism, let me bring up credentialism and being awarded the almighty without necessarily based on merit. Murdering 4.5 million kids. So to that point, a bunch of people have been out now defending Elon Musk, and and we're getting back into the discussion of USAID. And that was something I think we could talk a little bit about foreign aid because little aid gets directly to the local actors. I didn't realize just how little aid actually got in the hands of local actors. And, the idea behind foreign aid and development is not just that it's a handout, but that we're doing something to, improve, invest. It's supposed to be an investment, right? And invest in the future of countries that are less developed as us. But I think we need to be honest about the reality of how and where it started. It really came out of the Cold War. Its roots from the Marshall Plan, right? Our intent to influence and promote capitalism and democracy. Dying. First of all, let me just clarify that was a paper's projections. It was published in The Lancet, which I believe it's a journal. The Lancet has become very political, but those are projections based on previous records, assuming zero aid gets through, and you can immediately poke holes in a bunch of them. So this paper was pretty discredited, but that didn't stop kind of Rokon from doing it. And to accuse Elon Musk of murdering 4.5 people what USAID was. And so I dug into it a little here, actors. And this 7% figure, this is versus USAID's calculation, 7.3%. That's USAID admitting that only 7 and the way they calculated that pretty much every other organization got to 4%. Well, here's the reality of the funding that 80 to 83% is contracted. The prime awards are to US based NGOs and contractors. And, what's direct access 4 to 12. But this right here is the important number. So basically 70 to 85%, in some cases even more, are retained by US primaries, right? So, and then you factor in the multilaterals, World Bank, UN, whatnot, and then all the admin costs. And the reality of USAID and foreign aid, it doesn't necessarily help the countries that it's going to, or it can be manipulated. Europe also has cut back their foreign aid, but it's important to acknowledge. So in 2025, there was $175 billion total spent in international aid. And that's among all, that's USAID, that's EU, European companies direct through the UN, a lot was done through UNICEF, the World Bank, all these organizations. So it was down, but to clarify, it has been trending down, especially from Europe, significantly. Europe has significantly cut their share of aid, but especially to the least developed nations. So the majority of Europe's funding went to Ukraine. So out of the 175 in total, Ukraine and Ukrainian related causes received 45 billion. So the remaining 44 poorest nations in the world received, was allocated $29 billion. Most of that is skimmed off the top, at USAID. It is a grift in my mind, believe. But so it's hard to argue that when only 4 to 7% is getting directly in the hands of local actors, that cutting it off is going to lead to, certainly it's not Elon Musk didn't kill 4.5 million students or children in Africa, but it is actually it's an foreign aid, it's a complex. Another important some research that I found. Oh, no, I don't want to lose that. That the grift pays. Getting a seat on the UN Security Council, the non-permanent, there's 15 seats and what is it, 10 of them rotate or
Yes.
maybe yeah. This was a paper done, completed by these were the authors, and a countries that 10 of the 15 seats on the UN Security Council are held by rotating members serving 2-year terms. We find that a country's US aid increased by 59% and its UN aid by 8% when it rotates onto the council. This effect increases during years in which key diplomatic events take place, when members' votes should be especially valuable, and the timing of the effect closely tracks a country's election to and exit from the council. So if it's up to, if you're just during a typical year, the average additional increase for a seat, and these are 2006 numbers, so much higher today, is 16 million. So this is per seat. These countries on average receive an additional 16 million in US aid and 1 million from UN aid. But during those important years, the numbers rise to 45 million from the US and 8 million from the UN. So basically, they're buying votes, and little of that money ends up in the hands of local actors and benefiting the local people. It is wild to me to imagine that here we are. We have, yeah, I'm gonna actually pull up one or two more things. I don't want to get too all over the place here, but we essentially we have a problem with some of this aid and what it actually the end result, what it actually does to the countries that receive it. So this was a study done, and the following article describes the principal agent problem in international development assistance. It shows how this problem leads to a top down approach in development projects, which may discourage local entrepreneurship and ultimately undermine sustainable poverty alleviation strategies. The author argues that African countries suffer most from this problem because of their high level of aid dependence. Some good examples of this are the textiles industry. And so when foreign countries donate like already goods, used clothing and whatnot, it has completely wiped out the small textile industries. Like we're talking these tiny little shops or the woman who literally sewing things, at home at hand. It is completely wiped out those industries in many of these African countries. And they have become dependent on the foreign aid. And it undermines the efforts to become safe, sustainable, and increase their own economic growth. And yet we still have how many people screaming that USAID and cutting all this off is going to kill millions of people. Yeah, it sorry.
No, I think one of the things that you highlighted there is how everybody takes their cut as this money makes its way eventually to where it's supposed to go. And that process of everybody taking their cut is why everyone was so upset that USA with what happened with USAID.
Yeah.
For those of you who are fans of the the television series House of Cards, Frank Underwood, Kevin Spacey's character, is a congressman. His wife Claire, in the beginning, she runs a NGO in Washington D.C., the Clean Water Initiative, I believe is what the name of it was. But it relied on donations and government grants to ensure that water is clean in certain parts of the world. And essentially, it like so many of those organizations, it's just an employment agency. And that money to fund these things comes from places like USAID. And financial support, one of the really difficult things about it is you're always trying to prove for the people that are trying to understand if they're getting a good return on their investment. People that are proponents of it always say that they're complex algorithms and metrics to place a value on this money. And the argument is usually if we don't give them the money, this is what's going to happen. I can't prove that these people aren't dying because of this money. But
Yeah.
my argument is if we don't give them that money, they will die. I can't prove it though. And and unfortunately too, so much US foreign aid is when you look at the entire federal government, it's not a significant amount of money. And so when you're talking about 15 million here, 10 million there, 20 million here, 2 million there, compared to Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, the defense budget, it's not a significant amount of money in the big picture, and which is why USAID was allowed to operate the way it did for as long as it did. Uh,
Yeah.
and I'm not at all convinced it won't come back in some capacity. It's too much of a it's too much of a bastion of DC class and how they operate. And when President Trump leaves office, I wouldn't at all be surprised if it if it makes some type of if it reincarnates itself. I doubt they'll call it USAID because I think the name is almost too toxic. So
Yes.
they might be rebranded, but I think they'll make their way back at some point in time.
I mean, ideally, though, what if we're going to give aid and going back to the original intent and purpose of aid, post World War II, we did provide food aid and we provided that to Europe, but there were conditions on that, and it was food aid that was grown in America. It helped American farmers, right? It benefited us, and again, that all makes sense. But the philosophy over time, foreign aid, foreign influence, right? So it started off as food. Then we said, oh, gee, the Marshall Plan. Obviously, we want to counteract communism, and we invested heavily in rebuilding and reindustrializing Europe. But then that same model doesn't necessarily work the same way in other parts of the world, like Africa, right? Where, Germany was already, when we invested and we fed Germany and rebuilt their economy and whatnot, there was already very similar aspects of their society and their system and their economy to ours, right? And so we weren't building from scratch. We were rebuilding. Obviously not, under a Nazi law. Some of it, but what we weren't starting from zero, right? They had industrialized that existed. We just needed to shift it away from military, towards basic production. But then we went to other parts of the world, like we get to Africa, and originally, the thought process was we have to that the political leaders are so corrupt that and if we provide, a certain amount of aid, certain type of aid, it will make up for make up for that corruptness, and it'll increase development, right? Suddenly people will start, these countries will develop and will be able to support their economy, but it didn't necessarily work that way. And unfortunately, we ended up, many argue we ended up creating some serious dependencies and enriching the corrupt leaders that are there and giving them this permanent power and control, and then forever slowing down like entrepreneurship or whatnot. And so we, for a while, like I said, we invested in, okay, develop your economy. But then we shifted. And at one point, it was basically like, okay, well, maybe it's not the leaders. They don't seem to democratize, and their economies they're not developing in the way that we had hoped. So we kind of shifted our approach and began to more directly subsidize food aid and education and medical aid. And in that case, at least, we were really able to start bringing down like investment in HIV prevention and education, vaccines. And in that case, we really were able to have a larger impact. But and by the 2000s, we kind of realized that boosting the economic growth, we weren't seeing that tied to the democratic reform and then ultimately growth. So we shifted as more healthcare, whatnot. But that's another trade-off. That didn't Shifting it to human capital didn't improve economic growth either. And in fact, once we shifted to more the human capital, economic growth was even slower than during the periods where we were investing under the philosophy, we'll invest in economic growth. So we're really kind of at this, this crux, this hits. And then more recently, there's been infrastructure investment, specifically like from China, but it has left some of these countries in significant debt and unable to manage that infrastructure effectively themselves. And now some of these African countries spend more on debt service than they do investing in their own economies. And it just kind of gets us to the larger question of, well, well, one, obviously we know so much of it is a grift, but in my opinion, it gets kind of this larger, what is the purpose of like the UN and aid? And I think it coincides very directly. Well, we also see a shift away from this idea of globalism and the world is flat and, just automatically have things built wherever it's cheaper and shifting more towards, direct national interest. And certainly that is what China has done in Africa. Largely their investments as part of their Belt and Road Initiative, but it has left these African countries with significant debt issues. And the Chinese, specifically these Chinese companies, when they came in to build out the infrastructure, they did not use local civilians for employment. So they didn't develop the skills. So again, I don't want to keep repeating myself, but they don't have the skills and knowledge to maintain this infrastructure. And they still owe China a bunch of money. And now, one of the things I will say that I've read is yes, USAID, we're shutting that down, but we didn't just cut off, funding for HIV medicine. It has been shifted under the State Department where they can more directly align, right? If we can just cut out the middleman, even if we have even if we're spending significantly less on foreign aid, if we're not losing 95 of it to the foreign aid industrial, NGO multilateral organization graft, then perhaps we will be more effective. But what's actually promising is the countries that have, their aid has been cut, they're seeing the most economic growth.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think some of this is it's kind of like supporting, given an adult child money, giving them an allowance, paying their rent. I believe that a certain amount of foreign aid or a certain percentage of all foreign aid, there there's an expectation of it's not all going to get to where it needs to go, and
Yeah.
that there's going to be some fraud, waste, and abuse along the way of that money getting there, particularly when you're dealing with the United Nations and all of their different agencies, and also depending on what country it's going to. Some countries are far more corrupt than others, and corruption we talk about Ukraine and Russia, the former Soviet republics. Corruption is a way of life. It's not even. It doesn't hold bribes and all those things are not viewed as they are
It's
in many Western countries. It's just the cost of
how
doing business.
yeah, it's how they do business. It's what they know. It's literally baked into the cake.
It is, and I think so that baked into the cake, recipe, if you will, a lot of diplomats, a lot of people in government understand that that's going to happen, and so there's a certain amount of waste that is acceptable to them. As a taxpayer, I don't think that there is such a thing as acceptable waste, and, we're probably never going to know the real story on Ukraine and the amount of money we've given them and how it was actually spent, but I don't believe any reasonable person would think that Ukraine spent all that money and none of it went into anyone's pockets or greased anyone's skids in Ukraine and how Ukraine operates internally. I thought it was a great idea instead of giving them weapons and money, make Europe buy weapons and then they can give it to Ukraine. At least our defense contractors and the defense industrial base is making money off the weapons they're producing instead of the US government just giving things that we already have away.
Yeah.
So again, the hard part to me about foreign aid is that when I talk about it, I come off as a get off my lawn kind of guy, as a grumpy old curmudgeon, and I mean that's how I come off. And I'm just like, okay, you sell me on why I need to give $13 million to some resistance group in Syria, and prove to me that they're actually using that money in some meaningful way. And it's a loaded question, Kelly, because you're never going to convince me that they're doing anything worthwhile with that money. You can't
Yeah.
convince me. And
Yeah, the
um,
Assad regime, man, he was skimming th I
Of
read
course.
somewhere the minimum that he was skimming, they thought was 80%. Minimum, minimum.
Certainly. And so again, when you take these 15 million here, 12 million there, it all adds up and now you're talking billions and billions of dollars. And it was just accepted that it provides stability to the world, particularly certain more heated regions of the world. So it provides stability and you can't prove that it doesn't. And I don't have to prove that it does provide stability. You
Yes.
have to the onus is on you, me, someone critiquing foreign aid. You have to prove why it doesn't work. And the onus should always be on the government. They should be the ones that have to prove why it's necessary and why it works. And the second part of that is obviously the government doesn't have to prove why it works. Their argument is it's necessary. You have to prove otherwise as a critic of it. But the second thing is too, it's 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 more abstract, but well, if you're critiquing it, you're not a very good person. We're just trying to help these people. You're not a good person.
Yeah.
Like
And
I said
you
on
know
last week's episode, Republicans feel like they have a monopoly on common sense. Democrats feel like they have a monopoly on morality. And well, why wouldn't you want to help starving children in Africa?
and
And
that was
it's
what Anna was going. Right.
100%.
That
Yeah,
was what well, you know, and this is in the same context of the conversation where he's trying to justify taking his billionaire tax, right?
absolutely,
Yeah.
but again, it just to me, it falls on deaf ears. I believe that when you're giving away taxpayer money to foreign governments or people in foreign lands, you have to have a more transparent means of accounting for that money, and
And
short of that, you get up that's how you ended up with USAID. If the people that were upset with USAID, that would if you were transparent if the government was transparent, then what Doge did to USAID wouldn't have been necessary. People would
yeah.
not have been fed up with an agency like USAID in the first place.
Yeah, and to your point, if anyone that you can just you take 5 minutes, you go on USAID's website and, there's an Office of Accountability that's tied to it. If you just read through and this is under Biden administration, this is under both sides, you briefly look at the reports that they were coming out. They consistently said, "We have a problem, we are asking for accountability." So the local, whether like maybe the UN or the because this money is being funneled through multiple places, right? Multilateral organizations. It goes to US NGO that then you know skims up, right? Goes to USAID, which skims off the top, then goes to the NGO, US NGO or nonprofit, skims their admin costs off the top, and however many it goes through before we get there. But they USAID itself and in the accountability office said we cannot get these lower organizations, including like the UN, which should be responsive. They will report when there's bad actors or corrupt people, somebody's been fired for mishandling the money. They will report it to the UN, but then it's not coming back up to us and the accountability office. So, and the USAID at one point, they just said that, the oversight said, hey, look, here's our rule we want to make. If somebody is fired for mishandling funds, as part of one branch of aid, stop just moving them over to another or another cause, right? Because the problem just keeps happening. And they were moved shifting, somebody got caught stealing, right? So or corruption, skimming off the top, being corrupt. They would get, they would just get slid over to another section, another cause. And the practice has continued. And here we are. And so some of Trump's justification too with some of these multilateral organizations is saying, we're saying, hey, you're being told about this. We're giving you the money. Please, you got to bring it back to us. You got to report it back to us. And even under the Biden administration, you can see many of these updates where it's like, this isn't happening. We can't. We're really struggling with the accountability. Also, some of it is just wildly ridiculous. Things we're funding, and we still have problems at home, right? Domestically, we have homeless veterans. In my opinion, That money needs to go help them first. But I see a place for foreign aid. I absolutely do. But I also just transparency. We're providing you this foreign aid. Is it maybe it's fair to have some expectations, right? That you won't allow, if we're providing some aid to you, some of these countries, that you won't be targeting American citizens or,
Yeah, I mean, again, so much of what happens in government, people want to think things are complicated. They People in government oftentimes complication, something that's complicated equates to more funding. And also, if it's complicated, it means fewer people, particularly whether it's congressional oversight, inspector generals, whatever the case may be, fewer people will stick their nose in my business. And while I think that foreign aid, while important, having attaching requirements to it, whether it's reporting requirements or concrete objectives that are easily measured, I don't think is unreasonable. If you send your kid off to college and you're paying for their college, it's not unreasonable to want to see what their grades are like.
yeah.
It isn't, you're paying for it, so you have a right to see your child's performance at a college or university. It's not a donation, foreign
It's
aid.
not.
Foreign aid is an investment. There is a return on this investment. In large part, yes, the United States is trying to do good. I don't downplay that. But we're also trying, in large part, depending on what part of the world we're talking about, we're trying to promote peace and stability, regional cooperation. There's probably 500, catchphrases or buzzwords that the diplomatic corps uses with foreign aid, and it's probably what is spoken about on a daily basis at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. Our future foreign service officers are going to go save the world, spending
Going
taxpayer money in foreign lands to make everybody happy and better. And if that were the case, and you could prove it, I don't think many people would have issues with it.
That's an important fact to remember when we are saying it is an investment. And I believe some of what it became was, well, clearly a slush fund for some, this whole aid network industrial complex. But also the expectation is if it's an investment, you want some return. And if we are investing in your country, we would expect maybe you wouldn't allow terrorism or organizations, terrorist organizations, you wouldn't turn a blind eye to them that are then attacking or threatening US service members or US citizens. Or to me, it just blows my mind that we allowed for a while that we never kind of connected this loop, even with some of these organizations and said, hey, we're not going to fund hostile, organizations that are hostile to the United States and what we're in our citizens.
Yeah, and I think and that NGO takes that money and everything they do with that money, as far as USAID is concerned, it looks on the up and up. But how they distribute it, what they deem necessary as far as how they move the money to where it needs to go is largely up to them. And one of the things with USAID that, as you said about a little over 2% of their workload,
The grants that are, yeah, are
their
paid.
grants, yeah, that, there's not a lot of there was not a lot of oversight in USAID as far as, when the State Department is giving out money, there are foreign service officers who manage it in the countries. There is at least some accountability to formal US foreign aid. And there is a difference between what USAID did and what the State Department does with foreign military sales, which is not aid, but it is in a way because we don't sell just any type of weapon system to just any country, obviously. But I have a real issue with how the lack of accountability, and it's not political. USAID's lack of accountability and how they managed the funding they received from the taxpayers, it permeated Republican and Democratic administrations. It was not something that was just a symptom to Democrats in office.
It's the uniparty. It's the DC establishment.
100%.
that got
Yes,
rich. I found an example. Again, this stuff comes up pretty quickly once you start to dig into it. A Syrian national was charged with diverting millions in USAID funding to support a terrorist organization, right?
certainly.
So,
But
yeah,
they also enjoyed anybody. I lived in the national capital region for almost a decade, and USAID was in the Ronald Reagan building,
yeah,
a hop, skip, and a jump from the White House. It is a beautiful building. It hosts amazing events in the spring, the Cherry Blossom Festival. It hosts the Pink Tie Party, which I was a fan of attending. And you were in USAID essentially. Their offices are in the building, and they look down on the common areas, and it's a beautiful place to work. There weren't many nicer places to work in the nation's capital than USAID, another or the US Institute of Peace. Amazing buildings, amazing views, not much accountability. No one really knows what you do, and both parties support it.
yeah.
And so it was a really good gig. And again, I would be shocked if it doesn't come back in some manner, potentially rebranded. But it will make its way back because, the DC class, they need things like USAID. That's how they make their friends and their family richer. That's how they fund things that they wanna do in overseas countries. It's
So I'm
again,
gonna
I sound like a curmudgeon and a get off my lawn old guy, but I kind of am. I've seen it up close and personal, both overseas and from being in DC and how they operate. And both sides do it. I cannot emphasize that enough.
It is 100%. It's a uniparty DC swamp, issue. And but the reality is too, again, once and the idea was USAID would advance US policy goals. Now, the issue becomes when the policy goals that are being pushed maybe don't align directly with the current administration. So I'm going to put you on the spot here a little bit, Richard. I'm going to say, what are your thoughts? Do you think it's just sheer coincidence that USAID funding was cut and suddenly we see in our own backyard this shift away from left leaning governments, and we see like in Latin America a bunch more of right wing government or leaders being elected in? And could any of USAID funding have traveled through to promote actually anti-American?
I think once USAID funding left the building, if you will, it could have gone anywhere. They It's just impossible to for one to the idea that it couldn't have gone to anti-American organizations or governments, political parties, that
Yeah.
don't have US interests, the best interests of the United States in mind. The idea that that didn't happen to me is just ridiculous. It did. It happened on a regular basis. There's plenty of receipts about this subject. And yes, I do believe that it's a plausible theory that you pose, Kelly, that USAID going away and some shifts in how elections and governments operate in well, for South America, for example. I don't think I don't think you can dismiss the possibility that those two things are linked.
Yeah. We also did obviously push out the influence of like China and Iran and Russia and Venezuela. Yeah, or well, not Venezuela, but I agree. I We know there are some cases where they've tied the been able to link the Tides Foundation, for example, directly with funding and promoting some of the socialist or Marxist ideas. And to me, that's the issue with USAID or or the funding when it ends up at an organization where there's actually when we lose control of it, right? Just a recipe for disaster, in my opinion, and for it to be exploited and used against us.
Well, and I think USAID, when you look at that, the world is still around and the world is turning. And without USAID, I look at it a lot like Minnesota with the Somali daycare centers. If they were legitimate, where are all these families who don't have daycare anymore complaining?
Yes,
And I don't see any of these countries that received USAID funding complaining because the people of those countries complaining because they weren't getting the money in the first place. It wasn't going
Yes.
to where it needed to go. Yes, there might be some governments who are complaining, and certainly there's NGOs and the political class, and a lot of members of Congress were upset about it because, they were losing a revenue stream. To put it quite simply, it got laundered, and everybody got their take as it went through the laundering process. And so
But to be honest, I don't care if those people are upset.
I don't either. And if people in whatever nation you pick, because USAID funding went all over the world, but if people in a country needed USAID money to survive, to have clean water or to eat, and they were a significant number of people, that would have somebody would says have said something. It would have been a story, particularly with the corporate media in America. They would have picked up on the fact that there's 50,000 people in some country in Africa don't have clean water anymore because USAID funding went away. And
100%, right?
yeah,
It
yeah,
will be news headlines. The
big
other
time.
people often don't mention is the important funding. It just shifted under the State Department, right? Like you mentioned, where it can be more directly tied with our goals and we can see and make sure it's ending up. But that is such an important point, Richard, that first of all, so little of it ended up getting in the hands of local actors. We know USAID admitted to at only 7%, but actually the calculation is lower, so 4%. And we know that the media, the mainstream media, there's a large group of people looking to find the examples where people are being hurt, and we're not seeing it. And what is disappointing and frustrating for me is it would have been great if while they were there digging, they would have reported on some of the ways the aid actually did hurt the local people. But we were
Yeah,
never going to see that.
yeah, you're not, and just like we're never going to see the level of corruption in the places that USAID sent money. There's never going to be a comprehensive report or a congressional commission or anything like that to really look into how bad it was and how much taxpayer money we're talking about. Because over the history of USAID, we're talking hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars. I mean, maybe not hundreds and hundreds, but certainly over $100 billion in the history of USAID.
And
And
the opportunity cost of all that money.
absolutely. And so again, it's one of those things where I believe much of Washington D.C., the uniparty, as you put it, which I agree with, it's a real thing. It does exist. I believe they have with President Trump. I think they have will wait him out, and things will get back to normal.
You think that's there?
So
You think
one of my assignments in the Air Force, I was in the logistics career broadening program at the Ogden Air Logistics Center in Utah. And the Air Logistics Centers are maintenance depots for the United States Air Force. And when I was at Ogden, there was about 350 to 500 uniformed military people in the Air Logistics Center. There was 11,000 civilians. And so the idea was if you get a colonel or now a two-star general runs it, there's a one-star deputy, there's another one-star and a lot of sixes, colonels. But if you get somebody, a colonel or a brigadier general, a one-star that you don't like, a lot of senior civilians would just say, he or she's only going to be here for a year and a half, 2 years. I'll just wait him out. I've been here for 15 years. I'm gonna be here for 25 more.
yeah, just
There's
don't
good ones
ruffle
and bad.
feathers while he's here.
Yeah, and Washington D.C. is kind of like that with presidents. Nah, you know, Trump's not going to be there, and January 20th of 29, he's gone. And for the political class and the elites in D.C., they'll wait it out, and they'll get back to how they want business to be. Again, it might come back as USAID, or it might get rebranded. But I would be shocked if it doesn't make some type of comeback.
Yeah. And so that will be interesting. And that's why Trump is the threat, right? Because he's not a DC insider. So he was willing to rip up some of the previous presidents had kind of grown up and come to age in the DC political world. So and Trump didn't, he he was very, very much different in that way. I mean, and I don't even know if it's that. Is Mark Helper will often say, he's just one of a kind. There's just nobody like him. And I one of the things I'm seeing a little bit, he does seem to have certain people in this administration, Marco Rubio certainly didn't have any issues ripping up AID and challenging that. But in one of the ways that I hope we don't see the return to that same idea of just the slush fund and the uniparty getting rich and holding on to power. Like some of the things Rubio's done, shifted under the State Department. But another place I see that changing is under Scott Bessent and the Treasury. And Scott Bessent gave a speech last night, and he he said, I believe exactly. So tonight, I would like to take the next step and describe our strategy for economic statecraft, by which I mean the disciplined use of Americans' economic power in service of our sovereignty. So I expect that we are going to see our role in the world and the way we interact with the rest of the world change. change. Although I believe it's already happened and happening, and I believe it's not us leading this charge. The rest of the world, specifically China, is sort of driven this and this idea that let me just read quickly what he says here, because I think these are important points. For the better part of a century, the United States was the principal architect and guarantor of an open global economic system that delivered enormous benefits. It raised our allies from the ruin of the war, widened the channels of global trade, lifted standards of living, and attained a position of influence that remains unmatched in modern history. But the success of that system does not absolve us from revisiting its assumptions. America shaped the post war order in a world in which our overriding task was to help allies rebuild their economies and defend against the specter of communism. We accepted asymmetries because they served a larger strategic position. We opened our market because it helped to create a more prosperous world, and we tolerated imbalances because American economic strength appeared unassailable. Over time, however, these choices hardened into habits, habits into assumptions, and assumptions left unexamined into vulnerabilities. We came to believe that access to the American market could be extended without condition and therefore without consequence. We assumed that closer economic integration would result in a greater convergence of interests, that supply chains would function in every crisis, low prices would compensate for lost capacity, and above all, that other countries would treat our firms as fairly as we had treated theirs. Of course, those assumptions failed to materialize, some slowly, some all at once. And he kind of goes on. I think that's very sobering. And, he talks about in recent decades, we've watched strategic industries migrate abroad, supply chains concentrate in jurisdictions that do not share our interest, foreign subsidies, forced technology transfer, discriminatory taxation, non-market practices distort competition, and American firms grow to global scale only to become targets of policies designed to constrain or replace them. But beneath each of those outcomes lay an economic policy that became unmoored from our national strategy. And I think that this is so important. I recommend everyone read the speech, listen to it. He goes on and he talks about he lays out his plan, his approach for economic statecraft and 5 core principles. And I'll mention those 5 core principles quickly. Won't go into the full detail. But first, that the economic security begins with national capacity, and he references Hamilton. The second principle is that America's openness will be matched by reciprocity, which is the basis of durable cooperation. The third principle is that America will write the rules of the next economy. The fourth principle is that financial leadership is a central instrument of statecraft. And fifth, and the most important principle, is that economic statecraft must serve the American people. Like we were talking about with the USAID and the funding, I think Bessent nails it perfectly. And what I wonder is, will the changes made under the Trump administration, if successful, make it almost impossible to go back to some of that the way it used to be, or wait it out?
Well, I think that's an interesting question. One of the problems I've always had with President Trump is his lack of patience in the DC climate. Executive orders aren't forever, and it's important to work with Congress. It's important to work with your party's leadership. And so, while I think Secretary Bessent's done a wonderful job. I think he's a transcendent Treasury Secretary. Uh, in my lifetime, short of the financial crisis in Kuwait, I can't think of a more influential Treasury Secretary pushing an agenda, leading the Treasury Department in a almost military way as far as a commanding presence of the Treasury Department and its importance in the government. There's a reason the Treasury Department is right next to the White House. When our nation was founded, it was the War Department, the Treasury Department, and the
Yes.
State Department. And there was an Attorney General, but there was no Justice Department. And they're all closest to the White House, or well, they were at one point for a reason. So I think what the secretary is trying to accomplish has teeth. It's well thought out, and it's an important part of how America's role in the world is going to change because, again, to the national security strategy and everything that's been laid out, the game has changed
Yeah.
for better or for worse. Obviously, people are going to have opinions on it, but our role in the world is not going to look the same as it has for decades and decades. And I'm glad that Bessent is being proactive and taking steps to implement this vision he has. I just hope that it gets far enough down the tracks that it's too difficult to unwind for a
Yeah.
future administration. There's some policies that transcend both political parties and both administrations. You go back to the Cold War and you think about mutually assured destruction, and that was something that both, that did not change from Kennedy and Johnson to Nixon to Carter, well, Ford, then to Carter, right? And what Bessent's trying to do with economic statecraft, it's great. It just needs to get far enough down the tracks that whoever the next administration is, if it's not a Republican administration, that they just can't unwind it and tear down the Lego set quickly and go back to the old ways. That's my biggest concern is that this is on shaky foundation and it won't survive as a matter of policy the next administration. Even if it's a Republican administration, what Bessent is doing, how he outlines economic statecraft, it's very threatening to the global order, to a lot of very wealthy people around the world, and how America supports various nations and various global sectors. So I think it's really interesting. I'm a huge fan of Secretary Bessent. I think he is shaking things up, and he's shaking things up as somebody he was an insider. He was a part of the
Yeah.
club,
Yeah.
and he's not Donald Trump. Like Bessent was when it comes to, the financial world, he was definitely a part of the club.
He was one of the men that broke the Bank of England. If he
Yeah.
knows currency, he's been on the other, the other side of it. And to your point, I agree. Hopefully this can't just be walked back because again, it's because it is change. It's fundamental change. But Richard, I honestly feel like we don't have much of a choice because the world has changed, right? China plays this game. Even, Russia plays this game. But really China has established it kind of broken up. They never fully embraced the world is flat. They never fully liberalized, democratized their markets. They were welcomed in, and the idea was we'll welcome them in and it let them into WTO, and they'll eventually democratize and liberalize their markets and update their rules, and they'll get on board with they'll match Western markets, and that never happened, and for us to try to stay stuck in this idea that nothing has changed or we can continue on this way, this is one of the things I think that's often misunderstood about this conflict in Iran. I believe we may see oil. It's a fungible commodity. It's traded. It's a global commodity traded. But I believe we actually already are seeing some of it. That we may see almost a balkanization of oil in the markets, and where you get your oil from may determine some of the price, how it's moved. Whether it be the Strait of Hormuz. But I believe this whole, the strait has closed. We heard how many people screaming $200 a barrel oil, right? We it the world is falling or the sky is falling, things are breaking up. Just today, really quick, I think it's important to note Iran has been threatening to close this. Well, they were closed, it's open, but they've been threatening to toll it. Well, Oman came out publicly today and said, we want to clarify, we are not going to be tolling. There will be no fee, and that anyone is free to use the channel off the Omani territorial waters. And that's the southern route through there. And that is what the US and many of these, we talked a little bit about national oil companies and how on a previous episode, how they're moving oil, like this would be like Saudi or UAE, like and ARC and ARC. What is it? The drawing a blank on the name of the Saudi oil company now, but
Oh,
like the
Aramco.
Aramco. Sorry, I always get it mixed up with something else. Aramco and how they're using state owned, so they don't need insurance. This is that commercial insurance that important aspect that was controlled, the war risk insurance that, they priced out, basically made it has been available, but it's so expensive. It's so expensive, not these ship owners just in charters say, "I'm not gonna pay it," but oil has been moving through there, and all these people screaming, $200 a barrel, "The world's gonna end. Oh my goodness, Iran is in control." It ignores the reality on the ground that we've been moving, 200 million plus barrels through that southern route. And that's just what Trump announced. But today, so the UAE in June has moved like 4.1 over 4 million has been exporting, moving over 4.1 million barrels a day. But that's really important to note because it's 977,000 more barrels per day than a year ago. But they left OPEC. And this ties right back into this approach Bessent has taken. We agreed with the UAE that they would have access to a US dollar swap line. That again, that's not borrowing. That's not borrowing money. That's basically guaranteeing them permanent access to hard US dollars that they need. OPEC or UAE left OPEC. They're now producing year over year almost a million barrels a day, exporting more than a million barrels a day more. And the UAE is committed to continuing to fund 100% alternative routes. So they would have zero reliance on the Strait of Hormuz. And that's just the UAE. Other countries are investing in it. We know Saudi has, and they will continue to. And everyone keeps saying this is America's Suez crisis as compared to the Egyptians or the British in Egypt and in the 50s. And yes, there are similarities, but there are also things that are very different. Just right off the bat, one, during that time, we were not helping the Brits out. We were totally okay with them getting pushed out of the Middle East a little. We allowed a run on the pound and wouldn't jump in to help because we wanted to be the ultimate controller of the oil resources in the Middle East. And that was just an easy step, an easy way. And when the Suez was closed, it was closed twice. And the second time after the 6 Days War, it was closed for an extended period of time, like 8 years. That completely changed the way oil and energy was transported. During that closing period, so much money was invested into building these VLCCs and ULCCs, these very large crude carriers. So it suddenly became cost efficient to run things down, and around Africa. The Strait of Hormuz, that has been played. It will never carry the weight. That threat will never be the same as it was. And it will never, Iran played their biggest card. And when they played it, and we're not seeing the oil shortage here in America as much, but when they played it, the world didn't end.
Yeah, it's all yeah, I saw the Omani announcement and it has a lot of legitimacy because it was coordinated through the
I know.
International Maritime Organization, IMO, and
With US
um,
forces too.
what's that?
In conjunction with US forces.
Yes, and we're providing air cover, and again, it the Strait of Hormuz to the point that if anybody can figure out a way around it and bypass it, it is the Gulf Coast countries who produce oil. They have the resources and the wherewithal to build the pipelines to bypass it. They have no problem doing that. They're not concerned about jobs in their port cities, if you will. Nobody's going to starve in the energy industry in Saudi Arabia. So one of the things that you touched on with Secretary Bessent and how things might be moving forward is when he says what he said in his speech, given what the administration has done and the norms, if you will, that they have broken in the world order, when a member of the administration discusses how we may not be performing the role that we have traditionally performed, that you all have come to rely on, that you don't pay for. When he says things might change, they believe it because of what the administration has done diplomatically, militarily, economically already. And so I think that they're creating what they're doing is in many ways fascinating because while media is focused on the reflecting pool and stupid things like that.
No,
They are
he's
the US is strengthening part of this economic statecraft is is bringing capabilities back home from overseas, production, manufacturing, looking for critical resources, minerals closer to home. And so this is all going on while we're talking about things that are dumb, like yeah, like the reflecting pool and the UFC fight at the White House. While and so and you also touched how this is all of this goes back to the national security strategy in China, and so something I would like to touch on in a future episode is what was released by Tulsi before she left the
yeah,
ODNI job about China and COVID and what that's going to look like in the future as far as Congress and any investigations. But also, I think and again, I'm kind of teasing for a future episode. I think it's interesting to explore the extent to which we protected the PRC and the entire COVID affair and the lengths we went to and our responsibility in it because we funded
yeah.
this research
But
to
sorry, let me
me that really contradicts the national security strategy, the way we treated China, and it makes me wonder how much we would actually, have any, intestinal fortitude to defend Taiwan.
yeah, and I think not gain of function research was made, was made illegal or wasn't allowed under the Obama administration. And look what happens. You've got the likes of Fauci just offshoring it. So now we continue to fund it. We use like EcoHealth Alliance. Here, there go another NGO, nonprofit, right? That the government supporting, and then we lose control. And there was almost well, we know there was a lack of accountability. But then even when this happens, like what one of the things that came out was the Lawrence Livermore National Lab released an assessment in May of 2020, basically said, we're split 50-50. This has, we believe there's just as good of a chance that this came out of the lab. And this is one of our national labs, like a premier science lab run by the National Science Foundation at Department of Energy, and then that's buried. That doesn't make it up to, higher ups. That's the first we hear about this. So one of our leading labs who has probably out of all these organizations, possibly some of the most credibility because they're a lab, science lab. It says we 50-50 chance. That doesn't make it up to the top. And correct me if I'm wrong, but that didn't get up to the Trump all the way to Trump and through the intelligence community. And I don't even know at what point it ever made it up. If under the Biden admin that came out and the Biden admin knew that and again chose to do nothing. And yes, we're culpable in this, but look at what under the NAIAD. Here we go. It's Obama says you can't do it. And then we immediately just say, some people under him say, okay, well, we're going to continue to do it just over in China.
Yeah, and I add, the National Institute for Allergic and Infectious Diseases is a huge part of the National Institutes of Health and
Yeah.
has long history of issues when it comes to procurements and how they run programs. That all being said, to me, it's fascinating how this economic statecraft is going to change the landscape as it relates to certainly energy and commerce, but also how we counter China in the future. I would not at all be surprised if we get to a point in this administration where this economic statecraft leaks out into military aspects of foreign security as it relates to global trade, freedom of navigation on the seas, and that essentially what the president kind of did with NATO, that you got to pay your fair share. And at some point, Bessent, President Trump telling the world, y'all need to start ponying up for what the United States Navy does, guaranteeing trade and commerce around the world.
Yeah.
Because if we're truly going to shift to China, then we don't have a large enough Navy to do all these things.
Yeah.
And the Indo-PACOM commander is on the record before Congress stating he does not have enough ships to effectively defend Taiwan. He said that without saying that, but that's what obviously that's the elephant in the room when Indo-PACOM is testifying for Congress about deterring and countering China. So
And
it's going to be fascinating to see how it all plays out moving forward these next couple of years.
yeah, and as we're kind of wrapping up here, one of the things I think is people, we went and we did this with Iran, and ultimately we know the larger goal was to be able to try to free up resources out of the Middle East. And I think we may see kind of tied back, we're economic statecraft. I say we might already be seeing some more military statecraft. We've seen the political statecraft, but going into Venezuela, right? This administration, I think, is much more likely to utilize that. But we may end up in a world where, to your point about freedom of navigation, and when I read through the lines of Bessent's speech and what he's talking about, and just all the things that I'm seeing, we may shift to a world where we tolerate more tension and minor hostilities in other places, where we basically, like Trump has said many times, we don't get much through the Strait of Hormuz. So,
And when he says things like that, people listen now because there is a certain there's a certain amount of credibility to the craziness of some of his comments. He says things now that were just unthinkable 20 years ago, and that well, you have to be a team player in the global commerce, and you have to, there's diplomatic norms and all of these things, right? And when the this administration speaks, other countries know that it's on the table, whatever is being said. As much stuff as he says that is out of this world crazy, Europe really treated the United States doing something to Greenland seriously.
yeah.
I never thought we were going to invade Greenland. I don't think any reasonable person did, but it certainly got the attention of European nations and NATO. And uh,
But I don't think at that point, maybe they didn't quite understand the importance of securing these. There's a lot of rare earths and some minerals in Greenland too. And the importance of the Arctic defense. Maybe they didn't quite see that. I don't know. Maybe I could be wrong on that. But and their inability, and whether that's because they don't want to admit it or not, their inability to defend it.
Yeah, and again, we talk all the time about the United States talks about alliances, and they talk about that in the national security strategy. What is not discussed openly, but I believe is a big part of what Secretary Bessent is saying with economic statecraft and this national security strategy, a big part of it is that every relationship is going to be evaluated, and it's going to
Oh,
be consistently evaluated. Um, and I'm all for that. I've used the term stress tests in the past. You have to stress test our allies. We have to it's no different than a marriage. Okay.
yeah.
There's good days and bad days. And year 5 of marriage is very different than year 20 of marriage. And it takes work, right? And so being allies, being in NATO, being the leader of NATO and that military alliance, it's not just responsible, it's our obligation to evaluate relationships and to hold our partners accountable for what their obligations are to the organization and the safety and security of Europe. And so I think it's good to keep them on their toes. I think they've been comfortable for far too long. And I think that mindset that we've had towards Europe and NATO since Trump 2.0 took office is going to make its way around the world to
Yeah.
to every nation that relies on the United States for commerce, trade, any type of military or economic security, they're going to be stress tested as we move forward. And I think in large part, that's what Secretary Bessent was discussing the
Yes.
other night.
Yes. And he's just gonna be more blunt, open, and honest. And you know what, Richard, at the end of the day, this isn't that crazy. The idea that a nation would look out for their own best interest, it's really not a crazy idea.
It's not. And also to be more concerned with what's going on at home and in our hemisphere,
Yeah.
that's not a crazy concept. We should be concerned about what goes on in Mexico. We should be concerned about drug cartels. We should be concerned about what is taking place in Central America. Those are all legitimate. We should be concerned about Cuba. We should be concerned about Haiti. They're right off our shores, and I think you're probably going to see some type of effort in Cuba in the not too far future. So yeah,
Yeah. It,
I love that everything is on the table. I wish
yeah.
that it was. I wish the administration wasn't as chaotic as it is with its messaging. While comms are not everything, they are important. I think the Iran war would have been received by the U.S. public a little more. It would have been received better had the administration made a better case for it. And the sad part about it is they don't they have the players on their roster to effectively communicate, whether it's Secretary Rubio or they have people that are effective communicators.
Yes.
So I hope if we do something against Cuba, whether that's militarily or diplomatically or some combination, that the case is made ahead of time in a
Yeah.
better way than it was with Iran.
Yeah. To your point, the way Besant presents this, it's clear. It's simple to understand, it makes sense, it's logical, and I agree. Sometimes with Trump, the communications, it looks like chaos, it feels like chaos, right? And people don't like that. People don't like that. I imagine if you're a foreign country on the receiving end, you don't really like that. And but again, not being so worried about Iran, but it's if they can just communicate, because these are solid plans, right? These are common sense solid plans. So, and you mentioned this earlier, and I think you're so right about this. The patience to execute it, right? To communicate it properly, and because these are good plans, so we can't let this administration's shortcomings and Trump's, his chaotic nature and his communication style and his, sometimes he to spite somebody, he'll do something wild, and that's really like I really hope that somebody can get that under control and get that so we can focus on these positive impacts because my guess is most Americans would listen and read to what Besant said and agree with it.
Certainly. Yeah. And I mean, yeah, to your point about the president, I mean, I wish somebody could just take his phone away, but
Yeah, need to take his phone away, and, imagine if you're JD Vance, you're there in Iran, and suddenly he gets on and he threatens taking over the strait. You were trying to get a picture. It really it's not a good look.
no, it's not. All right. So it's been a great episode. Always enjoyed chatting with you and learning from you. And again, there's so much going on, and it's a pretty dynamic world right now. And I'm here for it. I'm looking forward to 250
Yeah.
and all the celebrations. And I'll be in some patriotic gear next week for our episode. And as always, thank you, Kelly. And on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and leave us comments. We're always looking forward to any feedback on how we're doing and what you'd like to see us discuss.
Yes, I am really looking forward to our 250th birthday, and my hope is that all Americans can come together and let's celebrate what makes us great, and let's celebrate we have a lot more in common
Yes.
than we do that separates us, and so I really, really hope that that's something we can all remember.
Amen. I couldn't
Yeah,
have said it any better myself.
and I enjoyed talking to you. Happy 250th.
Yep. We'll see you all next week. Thank you for watching.
Bye.